Get this incompetent security guard fired immediately. This is an absolute embarrassment. I looked down, calmly placing my crystal champagne flute back on the table. The glass met the hardwood with a sharp, clean click. You can't call Richard, Brenda, I said. My voice was perfectly measured, carrying a dangerous, smooth edge. Richard resigned 3 weeks ago, right after my father's 60th birthday dinner, when he slapped me across the face in front of everyone. This is the same man who left me stranded at an airport terminal when I was 9 years old, just so he could jet off on a luxury vacation with his new mistress and her daughter. Back then, I called my mother in tears, and she landed on the tarmac in a private jet to pick me up. By the time my father returned from his getaway, he found my bedroom completely empty. The only thing left on the bed was a cold, formal legal notice that made his new wife scream in absolute panic. Now, 24 years later, that slap in front of hundreds of high-profile guests was the final piece of evidence I needed to dismantle his entire commercial empire. My name is Riley. I'm 33, and I founded a federal forensic financial intelligence firm. Before I tell you the rest of this story, hit that like button if you've ever had to stand up to toxic family members who constantly underestimated you. The heavy leather-bound document slammed onto the fine bone china plate in front of me. The chocolate cake on my plate shattered, scattering frosting across the pristine white tablecloth. We were sitting right in the center of the VIP dining room at Atlanta's most exclusive private country club. Above us, massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, soft glow over hundreds of wealthy and influential guests, gathered to celebrate my father Thomas's 60th birthday. But right now, my father didn't look like a respected real estate mogul. He looked like a desperate man cornered by his own greed. "Sign it, Riley," he ordered. He kept his voice low, a harsh, gravelly whisper meant to escape the ears of the surrounding tables. I glanced down at the document. It was an irrevocable asset transfer agreement. He wanted me to hand over the entire trust fund my grandmother had left for me. I picked up my linen napkin, casually dabbing a speck of chocolate from my thumb, and answered him slowly. "I'm not signing anything, Thomas." I looked him dead in the eye, my voice flat and devoid of any emotion. My half-sister Madison slammed her champagne glass down, splashing expensive liquid onto the center floral arrangement. "You are unbelievably selfish, Riley," she hissed, her eyes filled with pure hostility as her diamond earrings caught the light. "Kendrick's hedge fund needs this capital infusion before tomorrow morning. Family is supposed to help each other." I turned my gaze to Kendrick. Madison's husband was a 33-year-old investment manager who usually wore custom Savile Row suits, projecting the image of a financial prodigy. He was supposed to be the family's golden boy, the Wall Street genius destined to double the family fortune. But tonight, Kendrick was sweating. His confident posture had collapsed into a tense, nervous slouch. He wouldn't even look me in the eye, keeping his gaze glued to his expensive leather shoes. He looked exactly like a fraud who knew his house of cards was about to fall. "Family is supposed to help each other," I repeated, letting the words hang heavily in the air. "That's a fascinating concept coming from you, Madison." But my answer is no. I'm not draining my grandmother's legacy to bail out a failing investment portfolio that has absolutely nothing to do with me. Thomas leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. The smell of scotch and pure panic radiated off him. "Listen to me, you ungrateful brat," he growled. "You're nothing but a glorified accountant. You have no idea how real money operates in this city. Kendrick is managing high-level investments. He's just facing a temporary liquidity issue. We need your trust as a bridge loan until his next quarterly returns post. It's a simple transaction. If you don't sign this right now, you are cut off from this family permanently. You won't see a single cent of my estate." I picked up the heavy document and pushed it back toward him. "Then consider me out of the family," I said. "I'm not funding a sinking ship just to save your massive ego." The crack of the slap echoed through the grand ballroom like a gunshot. Thomas struck me across the face with the back of his hand, sending my head snapping to the side. The heavy gold signet ring on his finger cut my lip, and blood instantly began to pool. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The VIP dining area went completely silent. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. The jazz band playing softly in the corner cut their music, leaving a suffocating quiet. Hundreds of eyes turned to our table, watching the great real estate developer strike his own daughter at his own birthday celebration. The silence was deafening. I could hear the ice melting in nearby glasses. Everyone froze, waiting to see if I would burst into tears or run out of the room in shame. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise a hand to my stinging cheek. Instead, I slowly turned my head back and looked my father dead in the eye. I ran a finger across my bottom lip, tasted the metallic tang of blood, and simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made my father take a step back. His chest heaved as he realized he had completely lost control in front of Atlanta's top investors and politicians. Before Thomas could salvage his public image, his wife stepped in. Brenda, my stepmother, was a woman dripping in new money and old resentments. She wore a gaudy emerald necklace that clashed with her sour expression, looking at me with absolute disdain. "You always have to ruin everything," she spat, her voice ringing out in the dead quiet, making sure every guest heard her. "You're just a bitter, jealous outsider who hates our happiness. We should have left you at Gate 42 all those years ago and never looked back." Brenda's words hung in the air. Gate 42, Atlanta International Airport. 24 years ago, they wheeled their designer luggage away, leaving a 9-year-old girl standing there alone with a crumpled boarding pass and a $50 bill. I didn't look away. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the white tablecloth right next to my shattered dessert plate. "You did leave me, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying a quiet precision that cut through the whispers of the room. "You left a 9-year-old at Gate 42 with $50 and a pat on the head so you could fly first class to Bali. Tell me, was the complimentary champagne worth it?" Brenda opened her mouth to snap back, but I didn't give her a single second to breathe. "Because as I recall, the moment your feet touched U.S. soil again, your vacation was over," I said, slowly standing up to match her height. "I remember the exact look on your face when my mother's legal team met you right on the tarmac. How did it feel, Brenda? Coming back with a tan, only to be handed a lawsuit that instantly froze every single one of Thomas's bank accounts." Brenda's spray-tanned face flushed a deep, blotchy red. She looked around nervously. 2 tables over, the mayor of Atlanta sat with his fork suspended in midair. The CEO of the region's largest bank was openly listening. The facade of this perfect high society family was being torn apart in front of everyone. Thomas slammed his hands down again, rattling the expensive crystal and silverware. "Shut up, Riley," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "You are causing a scene in front of my guests. You will show your stepmother some respect." "Respect?" I scoffed. "You want respect? After demanding I hand over my grandmother's trust to cover Kendrick's disastrous market losses? After striking me in front of all your high society friends?" I walked around the table, closing the distance between my father and me. Thomas was a large man who used his size to intimidate board members and contractors. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me to make me back away. I stood my ground. "You nearly emptied your early accounts trying to fight my mother and keep yourself out of court for child abandonment," I said, stepping right into his personal space. "You settled by promising under oath that you would never touch the trust fund my grandmother set up for me, and now, at 60 years old, you're begging for the very money you legally swore to leave alone. Why is that, Thomas? If you own half the commercial real estate in this city, why are you suddenly so desperate for my trust fund?" "Lower your voice," Thomas hissed, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight enough to bruise. I looked down at his hand, then back up to his face. "Take your hand off my arm, or I will break your fingers," I said calmly. Madison slapped the back of her chair. "You are completely delusional, Riley," she shrieked. "Dad was trying to give you an opportunity to invest with Kendrick. We were offering you a chance to be part of the family's wealth, and you're standing here yelling like a lunatic." I snatched my arm back from my father's grip. "An opportunity," I repeated, turning to Madison, who was shaking in her designer silk gown. "Kendrick is drowning, Madison. His fund is bleeding capital, and your father knows it. That's why he invited me tonight. This wasn't a birthday dinner. This was a setup." Thomas stepped in front of me, trying to block me from the rest of the room. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and frantic. "Get out of this room right now," he threatened, his voice trembling with rage. "Walk out that door and never look back. You are nothing to me. You've always been nothing, just a bitter girl who couldn't accept that I built a real family without you." I smiled again, feeling the sharp sting of my cut lip. "A real family," I murmured, looking over at Brenda, who was clutching her emerald necklace, and Madison, who was frantically typing on her phone. "A real family built on misappropriated funds and offshore shell corporations. I wonder how long your real family lasts when the liquidity completely dries up tomorrow afternoon." For a fraction of a second, Thomas's eyes widened. The panic was fully visible now, stripping away his billionaire persona. He realized I knew too much. He realized the people at the surrounding tables, the very people who funded his development projects, were hanging on every word. His illusion of untouchable wealth was crumbling. He straightened his jacket, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. He looked past me toward the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP dining room and snapped his fingers sharply. "Security!" he yelled, his voice echoing across the room. "Remove this person from my club immediately." The heavy brass handles of the VIP doors turned, and 3 men in immaculate black suits strode through the stunned crowd. At the front was Marcus, the towering head of security, a military veteran known for discreetly handling rowdy high-profile guests. He walked with absolute authority, and the wealthy patrons quickly parted to let him through. Thomas adjusted his silk cuffs, standing tall once again. The momentary panic I had caused was replaced by the familiar security of his wealth and influence. He pointed a finger straight at my face. "Escort this woman off the premises," Thomas ordered loudly. "She is trespassing at a private event." Madison couldn't resist taking a parting shot. She stepped out from behind Kendrick, her designer heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. She crossed her arms, looking at me with a mix of pity and venom. "You're an absolute joke, Riley," Madison sneered, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Look at you, standing here in a cheap off-the-rack suit trying to play the tough corporate executive. Go back to your sad little accounting desk, get back in your beat-up car and drive back to whatever miserable apartment you live in. You don't belong here. You never did. Kendrick and I are closing multi-million-dollar acquisitions. And you're here acting like a clown at our father's birthday party just begging for attention." I let her speak. I let her dig the hole as deep as possible. "By acquisitions, do you mean the ones Kendrick is desperately trying to hide in the Cayman Islands?" I asked casually. Madison's face contorted. "You have a sick obsession with my husband because you can't find a man of your own." She turned to the security guards, pointing a manicured nail at me. "Security, take her out. She's unstable." Brenda joined in, stepping next to her daughter. "Marcus, make sure her name is permanently blacklisted in the system," Brenda ordered, waving her diamond-ringed hand. "I want her photo at the front gate. If she so much as steps onto the golf course or near the valet, I want the authorities involved. We pay $300,000 a year for our platinum membership, and I refuse to breathe the same air as this person. Riley, I will personally call your firm tomorrow morning and make sure you are let go for attacking prominent citizens." Thomas squared his shoulders. "You heard my wife, Marcus. Take her out. Use force if you need to. Take her through the kitchen service exit. I don't want her ruining the main lobby on her way out." The 2 guards stepped forward, flanking me. Their heavy boots thumped against the floor. The entire room held its breath. The mayor stopped whispering to his wife. The bank executives leaned forward, watching with morbid fascination. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable moment when the cast-out daughter would be dragged out into the humid Atlanta night. I didn't move a single muscle. I didn't flinch. I calmly reached down and picked up a crystal champagne glass from the table, the one that had miraculously survived Thomas's outburst. Holding the stem, I raised it slightly toward my father in a mocking toast, then took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold liquid stung my cut lip, but my face remained completely blank. Ignoring Thomas entirely, I looked directly at Marcus. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. He was less than 2 feet away. He looked at Thomas, then back at me. A silent understanding passed between us. The silence was so absolute you could hear the ice shifting in the onlookers' drinks. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were watching a high-stakes chess match, and they suddenly realized they had no idea who actually controlled the board. The tension in the room grew suffocating. "What are you doing?" Thomas snapped, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as the veins on his neck bulged. "What are you waiting for?" "I pay your salary, Marcus. I said get her out of here." Marcus ignored him completely. It was a subtle shift in body language, but in a room full of people obsessed with power, the snub was deafening. Marcus smoothly stepped around my father, ignoring his pointing finger, and walked directly up to me. Thomas's hand dropped, his mouth slightly open in confusion. Brenda blinked rapidly, her sneer melting into a blank stare. "Marcus, what on earth are you doing?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden, unexplainable doubt. Marcus didn't even look at him. Instead, the towering head of security lowered his gaze and gave me a deep, respectful bow, the kind reserved only for absolute authority. He straightened up, his face neutral, and his voice carried clearly through the dead silence of the room. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his tone filled with unwavering professional respect, "would you like me to remove these trespassers from your property?" The silence stretched over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Thomas stared at the security chief, his brain unable to process what he had just heard. Cognitive dissonance paralyzed him. He was Thomas, the untouchable real estate titan of Atlanta. He didn't get thrown out of places. He was the one who did the throwing. A harsh, nervous laugh escaped his chest. "Have you lost your mind, Marcus?" Thomas demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the guard's chest. "I pay your salary. I am a platinum founding member of this establishment. You work for me. Escort this delusional woman out, or I will call the board and have your pension revoked." Marcus stood tall, unmoved. He didn't even glance at my father, keeping his respectful gaze locked onto me. "Your membership was formally revoked at 5 o'clock this evening, sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Your access cards have been deactivated, and your house accounts are permanently closed." Brenda grabbed Thomas's arm, her emerald necklace rattling against her collarbone as she looked around in panic, making eye contact with the wealthy socialites who were now staring openly. "Thomas, do something," Brenda hissed, her voice shrill with embarrassment. "Call Richard. Call the club president. He's your business partner. He'll sort this out." "Richard resigned," I said. "He's currently sitting on a beach in Monaco, trying to pretend his legacy didn't just evaporate." Thomas snapped his head toward me, his face turning a dangerous crimson. "What are you talking about?" he growled, stepping forward menacingly. I stepped aside, letting the 2 security guards clear a path for me. I spoke clearly, making sure the mayor sitting 2 tables away could hear every syllable. I wanted every bank executive and city planner in the room to understand exactly what was happening. "This country club has been operating at a massive deficit for 2 years, I announced. Their operational costs far exceeded their revenue, and they defaulted on their commercial mortgage. 90 days ago, the board filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy restructuring in a closed session. They were desperately seeking a quiet acquisition to avoid a public scandal." Thomas let out another sharp, dismissive laugh. "That is mathematically impossible. I review the commercial filings in this district every morning. There is no recorded acquisition and no deed transfer on the public record." "That's because the mezzanine debt was acquired through a blind trust," I replied, taking a step closer to him. "An anonymous private equity vehicle called Obsidian Holding Group. Obsidian purchased the club's distressed debt, assumed all operational liabilities, and effectively dissolved the board in a leveraged buyout." Thomas sneered, his lip curling in disgust. He looked me up and down, taking in my modest business suit. "And let me guess, you're a junior analyst for Obsidian? You think managing their spreadsheets gives you some kind of authority? You're just a bookkeeper with a fancy pencil, Riley. You don't hold any real power." "I'm not their analyst, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a razor-sharp edge. "I am the sole owner. I am Obsidian Holding Group." A collective gasp echoed through the surrounding tables. The bank's CEO leaned over, whispering frantically to his wife. A prominent judge sitting near the window dropped his fork onto his plate in shock. "She's lying, Thomas," Brenda shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Look at her. She buys her clothes off the rack. She doesn't have the capital to buy a parking lot, let alone a country club. Call the police. Have her arrested for business fraud." I looked at Brenda with pity. "You can check the county clerk's records tomorrow morning, Brenda, or you can just ask the mayor sitting right over there. He personally signed off on my commercial zoning variances last Thursday." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, suddenly finding his napkin incredibly interesting as he avoided Thomas's gaze. Thomas took a step back, his broad chest heaving. His wealthy, untouchable mask was cracking. The man who had confidently slapped me minutes ago was now sweating under the crystal chandeliers. His illusion of power was disintegrating in front of his most important investors. "Where did you get that kind of money?" Thomas stammered, his usual authority completely gone, his voice cracking with panic. "You had nothing. You left my house 24 years ago with a garbage bag of old clothes and $50. "I left your house with my dignity," I corrected him. "And I spent the last 14 years building a federal forensic financial intelligence firm that specializes in tracing dirty money. You thought I was just sitting in a cubicle filing tax returns. In reality, I've been auditing offshore corporate accounts for federal agencies." I took a final step forward, standing face to face with the man who had abandoned me at Gate 42. "Tonight, you demanded my grandmother's trust to save your empire," I whispered. But the truth is, Thomas, you are standing in mine, and I want you out. Madison had been standing behind Kendrick, her face cycling through shock, denial, and pure dread. She looked at the socialites who had been laughing with her earlier, now whispering and gesturing toward her. She watched the bank executives pulling out their phones to text their brokers. Her entire social standing was evaporating in real time. She shoved Kendrick aside, nearly tearing her designer silk gown. "No!" Madison screamed, her voice breaking. "No, this isn't real! You're a liar!" She bolted across the polished hardwood floor, her designer heels slipping. She collided with a server holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, sending salmon and caviar crashing to the floor. She ran straight onto the elevated stage where the jazz band was standing in shock. Madison grabbed the heavy metal microphone stand, ripping the microphone from its clip. A loud feedback screech pierced the room, making several guests wince. She stood on the stage, panting heavily, pointing the microphone directly at me. Her hair was disheveled and her face was twisted in desperation. "Don't listen to her!" Madison screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing through the grand hall and out into the lobby. "She's lying! She doesn't own anything! She's a thief who embezzled millions from my husband!" The screech of the feedback cut through the VIP room. Madison stood on the stage, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal stand. She stared at me, her panic thinly veiled by pure hostility. "She's a fraud!" Madison shrieked into the mic, her amplified voice vibrating the crystal chandeliers. "Don't believe a word she says. She doesn't own this club. She's a bitter, jealous woman who has spent her miserable life obsessed with us." I stood my ground, watching my half-sister unravel in front of everyone. The elite guests, previously frozen in shock, were now moving. Throughout the room, prominent citizens pulled out their smartphones. The glow of screens lit up the dining room. The mayor's wife was openly recording, a look of amusement on her face. Bank executives leaned forward to capture every second of this public collapse. Thomas waved his arms frantically, trying to get them to stop, but he was powerless against a crowd that thrived on high society scandal. "She's nothing!" Madison continued to scream, her voice growing more hysterical as she paced the small stage. "She's a disgruntled analyst who decided to target my husband. She embezzled Kendrick's money. She stole from his fund to finance this delusion. Look at her. Look at this sad 33-year-old woman with no husband and no family. She lies awake at night in her cheap apartment, scheming to destroy my perfect marriage because no man would ever look at her." The entire room was absolutely captivated by this chaotic performance. Madison was desperately trying to paint me as some obsessed stalker, hoping to save the high society image she had spent years carefully crafting. She was playing the part of the wealthy, successful wife, aggressively defending her brilliant husband. But her act was visibly falling apart. Her hands shook violently, and her heavy stage makeup couldn't hide the frantic sweat building on her forehead. I didn't look away. I didn't raise my voice to interrupt her wild rant. I just gave her a slow, unsettling smile, a look of absolute, calculated pity. That simple smile pushed Madison right over the edge. What little control she had left shattered completely. She threw the heavy microphone down, letting it hit the wooden stage floor with a deafening thud that made the guests in the front row flinch. She spun around and grabbed a half-empty glass of champagne from an abandoned tray on a nearby cocktail table. With a furious shriek, she threw the heavy crystal glass straight at my head. I didn't flinch. I barely even shifted my weight. The crystal glass flew right past my left shoulder, smashing heavily against the mahogany pillar behind me. Shattered glass and sticky champagne rained down onto the polished hardwood. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. Several women shrieked and quickly backed away, protecting their designer silk dresses from the flying debris. Marcus, the head of security, immediately stepped forward, his hand reaching for his radio. But I held up a single finger, signaling him to stand down. He stopped instantly, resuming his respectful stance behind me, waiting for my next move. I brushed a small shard of glass off the lapel of my tailored suit. Then, I began walking toward the stage. My steps were slow and deliberate. The crowd parted for me immediately, just as they had for security moments earlier. Madison watched me approach, her chest heaving under her silk dress. The arrogant bravado drained from her instantly, leaving a terrified woman who realized she had just attacked someone in front of hundreds of recording smartphones. She backed away from the microphone stand until her spine hit the back wall of the stage. I stepped gracefully onto the platform. I didn't even bother picking up the microphone. The room was so quiet that my voice didn't need any amplification to carry. I stopped just 2 feet from my sister, stepping into her space and forcing her to look me in the eye. "A perfect marriage?" I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal clarity that traveled effortlessly to the surrounding tables. "It's a fascinating fairy tale, Madison, but we both know you've been sleeping in the guest room of your heavily mortgaged mansion for months. We both know Kendrick spends 3 nights a week sleeping on the leather couch in his downtown office just to escape your endless arguments." Madison opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Under the stage lights, her face drained of all color, turning a sickly ash white. "You stand here and call me a thief in public," I continued, my voice dropping to a sharp, dangerous whisper. "But just last month, you maxed out 5 different platinum credit cards just to maintain the grand illusion of your lifestyle. Your husband's hedge fund is leveraged to the absolute limit. He's bleeding capital faster than he can falsify his quarterly reports. The custom luxury lifestyle you show off to these people recording you is a complete lie." Slowly, I reached out and gently tapped the large diamond pendant resting on her chest. Madison flinched as if I had touched her skin with a hot iron. "You're wearing high-grade cubic zirconia tonight, Madison," I stated clearly, making sure the nearby guests heard every syllable. "You pawned the real diamonds 3 weeks ago just to cover payroll for the skeleton crew at Kendrick's shell company. You stand on this stage screaming about my pathetic life while you are literally wearing fake jewelry to cover up a multi-million-dollar financial fraud." The dead silence in the VIP room shattered into a chaotic wave of gasps and frantic whispers. The smartphone cameras zoomed in closer, capturing Madison's pale face. She looked down at her pendant, her hands clutching her chest in a desperate, futile attempt to hide the truth. She was completely defeated, stripped of the lies she had used her entire life to elevate herself and look down on me. Before Madison could collapse onto the floor, a heavy hand gripped my shoulder. Kendrick strode onto the stage, placing himself firmly between his shaking wife and me. He smoothed the lapel of his $5,000 custom suit, trying to project a stiff, forced calm as he adjusted his silk tie. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his face were twitching. The charismatic golden boy was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss of his own ruin, still desperately trying to act like an untouchable Wall Street player. "You're playing with fire, and you're crossing into federal territory, Riley," he threatened, his voice a low, vibrating hiss meant only for me. "I will personally hand you over to the SEC." I stood motionless on the stage, letting his empty threat hang in the humid air of the VIP room. Kendrick glared down at me, puffing out his chest to project an artificial dominance. He adjusted his tie with a stiff, jerky motion, trying to hold on to his image as a financial giant. "You think you can just walk into this club and throw around baseless accusations?" He sneered loudly, ensuring his voice reached the wealthy guests recording on their phones. "Accessing confidential financial records without proper authorization is a felony, Riley. You're looking at wire fraud, corporate espionage, and severe violations of federal financial laws. I'll have my legal team draw up an injunction so fast it'll make your head spin. You've crossed the line, and you have no idea what you're dealing with." I didn't flinch. I didn't take a single step back. I watched the sweat bead at his perfectly trimmed hairline. "Federal financial laws?" I repeated, my voice carrying a cold, clinical precision. "That is an incredibly bold citation for a man who hasn't filed an honest quarterly earnings report since 2019. Do you really want to talk about compliance, Kendrick? Because it took my forensic team exactly 3 hours to audit your internal controls. That is how spectacularly terrible your books are." Kendrick's jaw tightened. He took a half step forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he spat. "You're a glorified bookkeeper. We execute high-frequency arbitrage and handle complex debt structures. These are sophisticated liquidity bridge mechanisms you couldn't possibly understand in your little cubicle. When I temporarily reallocated capital, it was fully protected under regulatory exemptions. My compliance officer cleared every single transfer." Down on the floor, my father Thomas let out a loud, theatrical laugh. Now that his golden boy son-in-law was standing up to defend the family honor, his arrogant, wealthy persona quickly returned. "Listen to him, Riley," Thomas shouted, pointing a thick finger at me. "He manages billions for Atlanta's most elite families. All you do is run numbers on a calculator. You are making a complete fool of yourself in front of the entire city." Brenda clapped her hands, her emerald necklace catching the chandelier light. "She's a criminal, Kendrick," Brenda declared triumphantly. "Have her locked up. I want to see her in handcuffs before dessert is served." Madison, who had been shrinking against the back wall, suddenly stopped crying. Watching her husband go on the attack brought the color back to her face. She wiped a smudge of expensive mascara from her cheek and lifted her chin. "Ruin her, Kendrick," Madison hissed. "Show everyone what a bitter, pathetic fraud she really is." The surrounding socialites and bank executives leaned in. The mayor kept his phone steady, capturing every second of the confrontation. Everyone was waiting to see if the brilliant investment manager would crush this cast-out daughter. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Kendrick, watching the frantic pulse beating at the base of his neck. I let out a slow, chilling, but completely genuine laugh. It wasn't a forced chuckle or a nervous reaction. It was the sound of absolute victory. "You want to call the SEC, Kendrick?" I asked with a smile, watching the last bit of bravado fade from his eyes. "Don't bother, I've already sent them your hard drives directly." Kendrick froze completely. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving his skin a sickly dull gray under the harsh stage lights. His hands hung limply at his sides, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking too large for his collapsed posture. I turned my attention away from my sweating brother-in-law and looked out at the sea of shocked faces surrounding the stage. I raised my voice, making sure every wealthy patron in the VIP room heard the absolute truth. "For those of you who only know me as Thomas's disowned daughter, or Madison's favorite target, let me formally introduce myself," I announced. "I am the founder and CEO of Aegis Financial Forensics. My firm is dedicated to dismantling corporate fraud, tracing offshore tax evasion, and prosecuting embezzlement on an international scale. We hold federal contracts with the Department of Justice, the IRS, and the SEC. And for the last 6 months, my primary target has been Kendrick's hedge fund." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of printed paper. "Let's look at the books, shall we?" I said, my tone analytical and devoid of emotion. On June 14th, Kendrick authorized a wire transfer of $2.4 million from the Horizon Tech pension portfolio. That money didn't go into municipal bonds. It went directly into a private escrow account in the Cayman Islands to purchase Madison's summer home in Aspen. Madison let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back until she hit the wall. On August 3rd, I continued reading, my voice cutting through the heavy air. $1.8 million was moved from a collective college education trust fund. This money was used exclusively to pay for Madison's personal shoppers at high-end department stores and to cover Kendrick's aggressive margin calls after he made bad market bets. He gambled away your children's college tuition just to fund her lifestyle. And just last Thursday, I added, delivering the final blow. A full $4.2 million vanished from the senior partner's retirement accounts. It was routed through a maze of shell companies to temporarily hide his massive liquidity crisis. He has been running a complex shadow ledger. He's been using new investors' money to pay off the old ones. Your Wall Street genius is running a Ponzi scheme, and tonight it has completely collapsed. The atmosphere in the VIP room fractured instantly. The gossipy, amused energy evaporated, replaced by pure, suffocating financial panic. The smartphones that had been recording the family drama were lowered immediately. Bank executives bolted from their chairs, knocking over expensive crystal and silverware. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as panic spread like wildfire. "Check your portfolios," I commanded the crowd, my voice carrying a lethal authority. "Call your brokers. Log into your secure financial portals right now. The quarterly statements you received last month are completely fabricated. The money is gone. You are holding empty bags." Absolute chaos broke out. Frantic shouting filled the grand hall. Men in custom tuxedos began desperately calling their brokers, yelling at each other in sheer panic. Women clutched their husbands' arms, their faces twisted in terror. The illusion of security and prestige was violently stripped away, exposing the devastating reality of their financial ruin. Thomas stood frozen near the front tables, his broad shoulders slumped, his commanding, untouchable presence completely gone. He was the one who had vetted Kendrick. He was the one who proudly vouched for this golden boy, personally introducing him to half the wealthy investors in this room. Thomas had staked his own flawless reputation on Kendrick's financial genius. Now the collateral damage was coming for him. A prominent local judge, who had invested his entire family's wealth with Kendrick based solely on Thomas's personal recommendation, pushed his way through the panicked crowd. His face was bright red, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. He didn't go for Kendrick. He went straight for the patriarch of the family. The judge lunged forward, grabbing Thomas by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo jacket and pulling the large man violently toward him. "Where is my pension, Thomas?" the judge roared, shaking my father with terrifying strength. Thomas's heavy silk jacket crumpled in the judge's tight grip. The older man shook him with a raw, desperate power. Thomas gasped, his eyes bulging as his stiff collar pressed hard against his throat. "Let him go!" a woman screamed from the back, but her voice was instantly drowned out by the chaos. The polite, polished facade of Atlanta's high society vanished in seconds. These people defined their entire existence by their net worth. Without their portfolios, they felt like nothing. Realizing their wealth had been wiped out, turned the elegant ballroom into a desperate scramble. A senior partner from a downtown law firm pushed a server aside, sending a tray of crystal glasses shattering onto the hardwood floor. He rushed toward the stage, his face twisted in pure anger as he pointed an accusing finger at Kendrick. "You guaranteed me safe returns, you liar!" the attorney bellowed. "I trusted you with my family estate." Kendrick stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the champagne Madison had spilled. He raised his hands weakly in defense, but he was completely out of words. His smooth financial jargon had abandoned him entirely. "Get off me!" Thomas finally roared, managing to pry the judge's hands from his lapels. He shoved the older man away, using trembling hands to smooth his ruined jacket. His chest heaved as he looked around frantically. He saw the angry crowd closing in. He saw his lifelong friends, his golf partners, and his business associates turning into a pack of hungry wolves ready to tear him apart. Thomas did what any cornered coward does. He looked for a shield. "Listen to me," Thomas shouted, his booming voice cutting through the yelling. He held his hands up, palms out, begging for calm. "I knew nothing about this. I swear to you I had no idea what he was doing behind closed doors." He swung his arm around, pointing a thick, trembling finger straight at Kendrick. "He deceived all of us," Thomas declared, his voice filled with fake outrage. "He's a traitor. He manipulated the books and kept me completely in the dark. I am just as much of a victim as you are. He assured me the investments were safe. He assured me the margin calls were handled. I trusted my son-in-law, and he betrayed my family just like he betrayed yours." Madison gasped. "Dad!" she cried, her voice cracking in absolute disbelief. "What are you doing? You can't do this to him. You introduced him to these people." "Shut up, Madison," Thomas snarled, not even looking at his daughter. He backed away from the stage, physically distancing himself from Kendrick's sinking ship. "He misappropriated our money. He is a criminal. I will personally lead the prosecution against his fund. I want to see him face justice for what he did to this community." Kendrick stared at his father-in-law, his jaw dropping in shock. The unbreakable alliance between these two arrogant men vanished in an instant. "You hypocrite!" Kendrick spat, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. "You gladly took the kickbacks, Thomas. You happily took the offshore distributions to fund your real estate acquisitions. Don't play the innocent bystander." As the two men turned on each other, the matriarch of the family realized the battle was completely lost. Brenda had been standing near the front tables, watching her husband publicly turn on her daughter's husband. She saw the fury in the eyes of the women she had spent decades judging and looking down on. She knew the life she adored was completely over. Brenda slowly backed away from her table. She clutched her designer evening bag tight against her chest, keeping her head down. Taking quiet steps, she retreated toward the heavy double doors leading to the kitchen. She was abandoning her husband. She was abandoning her humiliated daughter. She just wanted to escape the room before the authorities arrived. She almost made it. "Where do you think you're going, Brenda?" a sharp voice demanded. Brenda froze just 3 feet from the kitchen doors. The mayor's wife stood directly in her path. Next to her was the wife of the senior law partner, along with 2 other prominent socialites. They formed a solid barrier, blocking the exit. "Step aside, Sylvia," Brenda demanded, trying to summon her usual arrogant tone. "I need to use the restroom." "You're not going anywhere," Sylvia replied, crossing her arms. The other women stepped closer, surrounding Brenda. "You are going to stand right here and explain how your family wiped out our children's trust funds. You're going to explain how you sat at my dinner table last month, wearing clothes bought with our money, boasting about your new home in Aspen." "I know nothing about the finances," Brenda stammered, her voice growing weaker as her back pressed against the wall. "Thomas handled all of that. I'm just his wife." "You're an accomplice," the partner's wife hissed, stepping right into Brenda's space. "Take off that necklace, Brenda. If that was bought with our stolen capital, I want it back right now." The room had completely descended into chaos. The shouting escalated into a deafening roar. Two men were holding the judge back as he tried to lung at Thomas again. Madison was sobbing hysterically on the stage, begging Kendrick to fix this, while Kendrick and Thomas shouted mutual threats at each other. The beautiful elite country club had turned into a complete disaster zone. I stood quietly on the stage, taking in the spectacular downfall of the people who had treated me like dirt my entire life. They were tearing each other apart. I could have easily stood there and let them finish the job themselves. But I wasn't quite done with them yet. I bent down and picked up the heavy metal microphone Madison had thrown onto the floor. I walked to the nearest speaker and tapped the top of the mic against the metal casing. A loud feedback pop rang through the ballroom. The deafening noise forced everyone to stop yelling. The fighting ceased instantly, and dozens of angry eyes turned back to the stage. The wealthy guests panted, their faces flushed with anger, waiting to see what I would do next. I brought the microphone to my mouth, my face perfectly calm. "Don't let Thomas play the victim here," I announced, my voice carrying a smooth, lethal authority that commanded absolute quiet. "He is not a bystander. He is not the victim of a rogue partner. He is the mastermind." Thomas snapped his head toward me, his eyes wide with a new level of terror. "Riley," he warned, his voice shaking, "keep your mouth shut." I walked to the edge of the stage toward a small cocktail table. I reached down and popped the brass latches of my sleek leather briefcase. They clicked open with a loud, satisfying snap. I lifted the heavy leather flap and pulled out a fresh, thick stack of bank documents. The sharp rustle of the paper carried through the microphone, cutting through the remaining arguments on the floor. "Thomas didn't just know about the illegal transactions," I declared, my voice carrying a chilling certainty. "He facilitated them. He provided the offshore infrastructure that made this entire scheme possible." The judge, who was still glaring at Thomas, froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his chest heaving from the exertion. "Let him go, Your Honor," I said, stepping down from the elevated stage. "Shaking him won't reverse the wire transfers, but these documents will ensure he spends a very long time answering for them." I walked straight up to the angry judge and handed him the top document. It was a comprehensive financial ledger with the exact path of the diverted funds highlighted. "Look at page 4, I instructed him calmly. "Look at the transaction on October 12th. That is the exact day Kendrick emptied your family trust. He didn't lose your money in the market, Your Honor. He didn't make a bad trade. He intentionally transferred $6.8 million of your retirement funds to an offshore entity called Obsidian Logistics." The judge snatched the papers from my hand. He pushed his reading glasses up his nose with trembling fingers. I watched his eyes scan the highlighted routing numbers and wire codes. His breathing became incredibly shallow as the reality of the numbers sank in. "Obsidian Logistics is a shell entity," I explained, raising my voice so every panicked investor in the room could hear the exact mechanism of their ruin. "It has no employees, no physical office. It's a paper cover registered under Thomas's primary real estate holding group. Kendrick channeled your liquid assets into Thomas's failing commercial properties to artificially inflate his portfolio value." Thomas stumbled backward, his face a mask of pure panic. "She's lying," he rasped, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "These documents are forged. This is corporate sabotage." "These are certified bank wire receipts," I countered, holding up another stamped stack of documents. "I have the IP addresses that authorized the transfers. I have the digital signatures of your private compliance officer, and I have the incorporation deeds for every single shell company you and Kendrick established to move this capital. You engaged in a deliberate conspiracy." I turned to the panicked crowd of socialites and bank executives. When Kendrick's highly leveraged investments failed, he needed immediate cash infusions to cover aggressive margin calls. Thomas provided the illusion of liquidity. They created fake consulting contracts between the hedge fund and the real estate firm. They drained your portfolios to service their own debts and maintain their lavish lifestyles. The entire room was paralyzed by the scale of the betrayal. These were the city's elite power players, and they had been played for absolute fools by two men they trusted unconditionally. "It's a classic Ponzi scheme," I declared, looking directly at my father. "You were using capital taken from new investors to pay off the early ones. But you ran out of fresh capital, Thomas. The moment the market shifted, your chain of fraud broke completely." The judge looked up from the documents. His hands shook so violently the papers rustled like dry leaves. He looked at Thomas with pure, unadulterated disgust. "My grandchildren's college fund was in that trust. the judge whispered, his voice trembling with a terrible, quiet rage. "You looked me in the eye at the country club charity gala and swore my assets were secure." "I didn't know," Thomas gasped, taking another clumsy step back. "I trusted Kendrick. He managed the accounts." "Your signature is on the incorporation papers, Thomas," I stated ruthlessly, crushing his last pathetic lie. "You are the sole beneficiary of those offshore accounts. You violated every tenet of fiduciary duty to everyone standing in this room." Thomas looked around the VIP room. He saw angry bank executives reaching for their phones to call their legal teams. He saw the mayor's wife staring at him with pure, naked hatred. He saw the empire he had spent a lifetime building on the backs of others completely evaporate. Suddenly the color drained from Thomas's face entirely, leaving it a sickly gray hue. His broad chest began to heave irregularly. He reached up with a trembling hand, clutching the fabric of his shirt right over his heart. "My chest," Thomas wheezed, his knees buckling slightly. "I can't breathe." He swayed heavily, clutching his chest, staging a desperate medical emergency. He was begging for sympathy, hoping the crowd would rush to his aid and draw attention away from his financial crimes. But no one moved. Not a single person in the room stepped forward to help him. The wealthy investors simply backed away, treating him like a biohazard. They watched him struggle with cold, detached anger. Even his own wife, Brenda, remained frozen by the kitchen doors, refusing to run to his side. "Save the drama, Thomas," I said, showing no mercy. "The paramedics will take your blood pressure right after the federal agents read you your rights." I submitted the complete whistleblower file to the SEC 48 hours ago. "They've already frozen your domestic accounts. The FBI is seizing your corporate servers as we speak." Madison, who had been watching her entire reality crumble from the stage, finally broke down completely. She scrambled down the wooden steps, her designer heels slipping. She rushed toward Kendrick, grabbing his lapels. Her perfect hair was a mess, her makeup ruined by tears of desperation. "Tell them it's a lie, Kendrick," Madison sobbed, shaking her husband violently. "Tell them we have the money." Kendrick didn't answer his weeping wife. He just stood there, staring blankly past her shoulder toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. In his mind, he was already visualizing the federal agents he knew were on their way to dismantle his life. His silence was the final, devastating confirmation. Madison let out a deep, painful wail, falling to her knees on the floor of the VIP room. She buried her face in her hands, the large diamond rings on her fingers sparkling uselessly under the crystal chandeliers. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking past the sobbing Madison toward Thomas. He was still slumped heavily against a cocktail table, his fake medical emergency failing to elicit a single shred of sympathy from the angry crowd. He gasped for air, but his eyes darted around the room, desperately calculating his rapidly shrinking chances of survival. "You might be wondering why Thomas invited me tonight," I began, my voice easily carrying over the low rumble of panic from the ruined investors. "I'm the disowned daughter, the family outcast, the one he publicly cast out 5 years ago because I refused to be a silent player in his corrupt real estate dealings. So why the sudden olive branch? Why the invitation to this lavish dinner and a front row seat to this family drama?" Thomas froze. He locked eyes with me, his face twisting with a fresh surge of raw panic. "Riley, not another word," he warned, his voice reduced to a hoarse, desperate whisper. "Earlier tonight, Thomas pulled me into a private hallway," I continued, completely ignoring his pathetic command. "He struck me across the face, leaving a mark. Then he slammed a folder against my chest, ordering me to sign a legal waiver. He told me it was just a standard family administrative document. He claimed it was a minor formality to restructure a dormant holding company. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the crumpled manila folder Thomas had shoved at me hours earlier. I held it high, letting everyone in the room see it. "This isn't some administrative waiver," I announced. "This is a complete forfeiture of beneficiary rights. This document was designed to legally transfer absolute control of my late grandmother's irrevocable trust directly to Thomas." Brenda suddenly ran out from her spot near the kitchen doors, abandoning her cowardly attempt to slip out of the building. Her face was twisted with absolute hysteria. "Shut up, Riley!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking in the humid air. "You've ruined everything. You are destroying your own family out of pure malice. Someone make her shut up." No one tried to stop me. The private security guards remained frozen. The wealthy guests were completely captivated by the horrifying truth as it unfolded. And the mayor kept his smartphone camera rolling, capturing every second. "I'm not destroying anything, Brenda," I replied, my tone dangerously calm and razor-sharp. "I'm just reading the autopsy report. You see, my grandmother was the only person in this family with any real integrity. She knew exactly what Thomas was. That's why she placed her wealth into an airtight trust, completely isolating it from Thomas's corporate accounts. It was a pure, untouched pool of liquid assets, and more importantly, it was completely off the SEC's radar." I looked down at Thomas, who was now gripping the edge of a table, his knuckles white. "Your shadow ledger is imploding," I said, slowly and deliberately closing the distance between us. "The SEC subpoenas are already on their way. You and Kendrick have completely drained your investors' portfolios. The Cayman shell companies have been squeezed dry. You needed untraceable liquidity to get the federal auditors off your back, even if it only bought you a week. You needed clean cash to finalize your escape to a non-extradition country before the government froze your passports. My grandmother's trust was the last untouched piggy bank you had left." Another wave of deep disgust rippled through the room. The local bank executives who had once idolized Thomas now looked at him as if he were a rotting corpse. "He needed my signature to legally authorize the wire transfer," I explained, letting the hard truth sink into the minds of the angry crowd. "Without my explicit consent, the bank would never release the funds. He tried to intimidate me. He tried to physically coerce me. He thought I was still that frightened little girl who would blindly obey his commands just to keep the peace. He had no idea that I've known for years his entire financial empire is nothing but an empty, rotting shell." "You're a liar!" Brenda screamed, pointing a shaking, diamond-covered finger at me as her emerald necklace swung wildly. "We are wealthy. We are the elite of this city. You're just a bitter, jealous girl making up stories because you could never fit in with us." "Wealthy?" I repeated, letting out a short, humorless laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Let's talk about your wealth, Brenda. Let's talk about the reality behind those designer dresses and exclusive country club memberships, because my forensic accounting team audited your personal accounts too." Brenda froze, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. "You don't own a single thing in this world," I stated, my words landing like heavy iron. "This proud country club membership? The dues are 3 months delinquent. Those luxury cars you drove tonight? They are leased through Kendrick's fraudulent hedge fund, and the repossession orders were officially filed yesterday afternoon. Your sprawling estate in Buckhead? It's carrying 3 separate, highly leveraged mortgages, and you've missed the last 4 payments. Your platinum credit cards are completely maxed out, and your personal checking accounts are heavily overdrawn." I watched Brenda's arrogant mask shatter into a million pieces. She stumbled back, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. "You are broke, Brenda," I said without mercy, delivering the absolute truth. "You are completely penniless. By tomorrow morning, you won't even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. The government is going to seize every piece of jewelry you're wearing. They will seize your imported shoes. They will seize everything you own to pay restitution to the innocent victims you and your husband ruined." The silence in the VIP dining room was suffocating. The grand illusion was dead. The once mighty Thomas and Brenda stood exposed as desperate thieves living on borrowed time. Near the stage, Madison struggled to her feet. She looked frantically from her disgraced mother to her ruined father. The reality of sudden, absolute poverty hit her like a wave. Her parents couldn't save her. Her trust fund was gone. Her entire identity had been erased in minutes. She turned and grabbed Kendrick's arm again, digging her nails deep into his expensive jacket. "Fix this, Kendrick," Madison begged, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical whine. "Call your lawyers. Call your offshore bankers. Do something. You promised me we were untouchable. You promised me I would never have to worry about money. Fix this right now." Kendrick looked down at his wife. The frantic panic in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hollow reality. His life as a free man was officially over. He looked at her tear-stained face, her ruined makeup, and her desperate hands. He didn't see a partner. He saw the very reason he had pushed his fraud to the edge of collapse. Kendrick sneered, his lip curling with disgust, and violently shoved her hands away. The force of the movement sent Madison stumbling backward, her designer heels catching the edge of the stage. She barely managed to stay on her feet, staring in terror at the man she called her husband. "Don't touch me," Kendrick hissed, his voice a low, vicious growl that cut through the silent room. "Never put your hands on me again." Madison shook, her mouth slightly open, unable to make a sound. The charming man who had swept her off her feet, who had bought her diamonds and chartered private jets to Paris, was completely gone. In his place was a cornered, cold-blooded predator who realized his prey was no longer of any use to him. "Fix it," Madison finally choked out, fresh tears ruining what was left of her makeup. "You're my husband, Kendrick. You're supposed to protect me. You promised we were building an empire." "An empire?" Kendrick laughed, a harsh, grating sound completely devoid of humor. "You actually believed that garbage? You actually thought I married you for love?" The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around her stomach as if trying to hold herself together. "Let me explain something to you, Madison," Kendrick said, stepping off the stage and backing her into the center of the floor. The wealthy guests closed in around them, completely mesmerized by the spectacular destruction of the family. "I never loved you. I didn't even like you. You were nothing but a business transaction. You were the incredibly high entry fee I had to pay to access your father's pipeline of capital." Thomas made a choked sound in the corner, still clutching his chest, but Kendrick ignored him entirely. His predatory gaze remained locked on his weeping wife, ruthlessly tearing down every illusion she had about their life. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it was to pretend to care about your empty life?" Kendrick stepped closer. "Listening to you complain about country club seating arrangements, pretending to be interested in your overpriced Pilates classes, and your endless, mindless shopping sprees. You're a walking, talking parasite, Madison. You don't produce anything of value. You just consume, consume, consume." "I am your wife," she sobbed, falling to her knees as her legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood, her expensive silk dress pooling around her in a pathetic heap. "I gave you everything. You gave me nothing but a headache," Kendrick spat, looking down at her crumpled body with undisguised contempt. "I needed a human shield, and you were stupid enough to volunteer. I needed a clean name to put on the Cayman shell companies. Did you really think naming the offshore holding group after your maiden name was a romantic gesture? It was a legal firewall. Over the last 4 years, you signed hundreds of blank financial ledgers without once asking to see the fine print. You're a perfect idiot, Madison. You never questioned the math because you were too busy spending the stolen money." Madison covered her ears, her shoulders shaking violently as she let out a long, agonizing wail. Her entire universe had just been obliterated. The golden marriage, the untouchable social status, the endless luxury. It was all a setup, designed to make her the scapegoat. She wasn't a queen, she was the fall guy. "Enough!" Brenda suddenly screamed, breaking through the circle of stunned investors. She could no longer stand by and watch her favorite daughter be publicly dismantled. Brenda lunged at Kendrick, her face twisted in pure, savage rage. She raised her right hand and swung, aiming to strike him across the face. But Kendrick was faster. He didn't flinch. He simply raised his arm and caught Brenda by the wrist mid-swing. His grip was punishingly tight. Brenda gasped in pain, struggling wildly to free herself, but Kendrick held her firmly in place. Her emerald necklace rattled against her chest as she writhed helplessly against his physical strength. "Let me go, you monster," Brenda screamed, completely forgetting her polished socialite persona. "You're a sociopath. I am exactly what you and Thomas raised me to be," Kendrick replied, bringing his face close to hers. "You didn't want a good man for your daughter. You just wanted a shiny new hood ornament to show off at country club dinners. You practically sold her to me because of my title and my Wall Street background. You ignored every single red flag because I paid for your kitchen renovation and your imported cars. So don't stand here playing the protective mother, Brenda. You're just mad because your personal ATM is out of service." He shoved her arm away roughly, the force sending the older woman stumbling back until she knocked over a cocktail table. She clutched the edge of the table, gasping for breath, her eyes darting wildly to Thomas, who remained uselessly propped against the far wall. The room fell into a dead silence, broken only by Madison's gut-wrenching sobs on the floor. The bank executives, the local judge, the mayor, they all just watched. The once mighty family had completely consumed itself. Kendrick adjusted his cuffs, regaining a chillingly clinical composure. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He began typing rapidly, his eyes tracking columns of numbers on the screen. "What are you doing?" Thomas finally found his voice. "The authorities are on their way, Kendrick. It's over." "It's over for you," Kendrick corrected, his thumb flying across the glowing screen. "I'm transferring what's left of our emergency reserves into a decentralized, untraceable cryptocurrency account. The federal agents can have the shell companies, they can have the empty portfolios, and they can certainly have both of you. Kendrick looked up from his phone, his eyes cold and lifeless. "I'm leaving," he announced. "As far as I'm concerned, you people are already dead." Kendrick's thumb tapped heavily against the glass screen. The harsh blue light of the offshore banking portal reflected in his wide, frantic eyes. He hit the refresh icon, pulling down on the screen. A small loading circle spun endlessly in the center of the display, mocking his rising panic. He typed in a 12-digit bypass code, his hands shaking so violently he missed a key and had to start over. He cursed under his breath, letting out a stream of foul language that shattered any remaining illusion of his Wall Street sophistication. The wealthy guests surrounding us didn't intervene. The bank executives, the angry judge, and the betrayed socialites formed a tight wall around the room, watching the architect of their financial ruin desperately attempt to run away with what was left of their money. They were paralyzed by his sheer audacity. He was trying to rob them in real time, right in front of their faces. I didn't interrupt him. I let him experience the agonizing torture of watching his hopes get systematically crushed. Slowly, I raised my left arm, letting the heavy cuff of my tailored suit slide back. I glanced down at the gold Cartier watch. It was a beautiful piece, a gift I bought myself the day Aegis Financial Forensics secured its first major federal contract. The elegant black hands ticked forward with flawless mechanical precision. I watched the second hand sweep across the face, marking the exact moment Kendrick's universe turned to ash. Kendrick tapped the side of his phone hard against his palm, as if physical force could bypass international banking protocols. He began to gasp. He yanked the custom silk tie from his neck, letting it drop to the floor. He unbuttoned the top button of his stiff collar, taking deep gulps of air as if the grand ballroom had suddenly run out of oxygen. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He was hyperventilating, his body reacting to the sheer terror of his reality. Sweat dripped from his chin, hitting the glowing screen of his device. "Authentication denied," Kendrick whispered, reading the harsh red letters flashing on the screen. His voice was hoarse and trembling. He tapped the backup account portal, his fingers slipping on the glass. "Error, assets unavailable." I lowered my arm, giving Kendrick a perfectly polite, razor-thin smile. "Looking for the Cayman accounts?" I asked, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. He snapped his head up, staring at me with the frantic, desperate eyes of a trapped animal. The arrogance was completely gone, stripped away to reveal the cowardly thief underneath. "I had a federal judge freeze them at exactly 6 o'clock this morning," I stated, delivering the final blow with absolute clinical precision. "Every offshore account, every hidden shell company, every ghost wallet you thought you successfully encrypted behind 3 layers of proxy servers. We traced the digital footprint straight to your home IP address, Kendrick. The Department of Justice issued a global asset freeze before you even put on your tuxedo tonight." Kendrick's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. "You can't liquidate the Obsidian Logistics accounts," I explained, dismantling his defeat. "You can't touch the Vanguard trusts. The international wire transfers have been permanently blocked by the SWIFT network under direct federal orders. You can't move a single dollar, Kendrick. You have absolute zero." The smartphone slipped from his sweaty fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, loud crack, the glass screen shattering into a spiderweb of fine lines. Kendrick didn't even try to pick it up. He didn't try to run. He just stared down at the broken device as if staring at his own defeat. His knees buckled slightly, and he collapsed against the edge of the stage, completely hollowed out. The crowd of investors let out a collective breath. The finality of the moment washed over the room. The money was indeed gone, but the man who stole it had been completely neutralized. He wasn't going to a tropical island, he was going to federal prison. In the corner of the room, Thomas pushed the cocktail table aside. His breathing had evened out, but his eyes were wild. His fake medical emergency vanished, replaced by a genuine psychological breakdown. He looked at Kendrick's shattered phone. He looked at Madison sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, her silk dress ruined. He looked at Brenda shaking against the wall, stripped of her wealth and status. And then Thomas looked at me. He stared at the daughter he had deemed worthless. The daughter he had publicly humiliated and abandoned. The daughter who, in less than an hour, without once raising her voice, had systematically dismantled his entire corrupt empire. A strange, choked sound came from Thomas's throat. It started as a low, wet cough, then transitioned into a sharp, rhythmic chuckle. His chest twitched as the sound grew, vibrating deep in his throat. Within seconds, Thomas threw his head back and began to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a loud, booming, manic laugh that bounced horribly off the mahogany walls and crystal chandeliers. It was the sound of a man completely cracking under the weight of his own arrogance. He laughed at his ruined legacy. He laughed at his bankrupt wife. He laughed at the angry judge who was currently on the phone with the authorities. The wealthy guests backed away in horror, watching the patriarch of Atlanta's elite slide into absolute madness. Thomas clutched his stomach, his laughter echoing endlessly, drowning out even the distant wailing sirens that were drawing closer. Thomas's laughter didn't fade into tears or desperate gasps. Instead, it hardened. The manic, chaotic edge smoothed out into something much more chilling. It became a cold, calculated chuckle. He lowered his hands from his chest, completely abandoning the pathetic act of his heart attack. He stood up straight, looking down at the shattered remains of his family. He looked down at Kendrick, who was still slumped on the floor, staring at his broken phone. With the toe of his Italian leather shoe, Thomas kicked the shattered device across the room. The sharp click of the phone hitting the mahogany baseboard made several frozen investors flinch. "You've always been a short-sighted amateur, Kendrick," Thomas sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You panic over a few frozen offshore accounts. You fall apart because a girl managed to secure an injunction. You have no vision. You thought marrying my daughter made you my equal, but you're just a bottom-feeding parasite who cracked under pressure." Thomas turned his gaze back to me. The panic that had gripped him minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was a chilling, immovable arrogance. He reached up, calmly adjusting the lapels of his custom suit jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles with practiced precision. He rolled his shoulders back, taking a deep breath of the heavy air as if he owned every bit of oxygen in the room. "You think you've won, Riley?" Thomas said, taking slow, measured steps toward the stage. He walked right past the angry bank executives as if they were invisible statues. "You think freezing those Cayman accounts means anything to me? You think exposing this little shell game is going to put me in a federal prison?" He let out another sharp chuckle, shaking his head in mock pity. "You are exactly like your mother, before she learned how the real world actually works. You're laughably naive. You look at a few $1 million missing and think it's the end of the world. You're playing in the dirt while I build empires." The room remained frozen. The sheer audacity of his confidence was mesmerizing. The SEC was on the way. The FBI was seizing his corporate servers. Yet, Thomas stood in the center of the VIP room acting like a king who had just secured his throne. The angry socialites and executives exchanged uneasy glances. In the face of his complete lack of fear, the certainty of their righteous anger suddenly wavered. "You want to talk about my shadow ledger?" Thomas challenged, raising his voice so the entire room could hear his grand declaration. "Let's talk about tomorrow morning. Let's talk about tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock when the market opens." He looked around at the terrified investors, his lip curling in a triumphant, mocking sneer. "You fools are crying over a few million. You should be on your knees thanking me for carrying you this long. Tomorrow morning, my real estate holding group is finalizing a massive, multi-billion-dollar merger with Vanguard Equities." A collective, audible gasp erupted from the bank executives. Vanguard Equities was a global giant, a financial colossus capable of swallowing entire industries. They were the biggest player in commercial real estate, with nearly limitless legal and financial power. "The contracts are drawn," Thomas boasted, spreading his arms as if bathing in the audience's awe. "The due diligence is complete. Vanguard is absorbing my entire commercial portfolio as the anchor for their expansion into the Southeast. They are injecting $4.2 billion of pure, undiluted capital directly into my corporate infrastructure." He pointed a thick finger straight at my chest, his eyes burning with toxic triumph. "Do you understand what that means, Riley? It means that legally and financially, I am untouchable. Vanguard's legal department is a private army. Once I am under their corporate umbrella, the SEC won't even look in my direction. They will bury your little whistleblower file in decades of corporate litigation. I will settle with these pathetic investors for pennies on the dollar, quiet them down, and I will walk away a billionaire." The realization swept over the room like a wave of ice water. The investors who had been ready to tear him apart minutes ago now looked at each other in shocked, uncertain silence. If Thomas was telling the truth, he was about to become too big to fail. The government rarely prosecuted billionaires backed by conglomerates like Vanguard. The stolen money would be covered, the books would be miraculously balanced, and Thomas would walk away clean. Brenda, who had been cowering by the table, suddenly stood up straight. The color rushed back into her pale face. The terrifying prospect of losing her Buckhead mansion, her imported cars, and her country club status vanished in an instant. She looked at her husband and saw that her lavish lifestyle had been completely safely restored. She smoothed the fabric of her silk gown and stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas. The toxic united front was back, an impenetrable wall of elitist arrogance. She completely ignored Madison, who was still sobbing on the floor. Her golden girl was no longer useful, so she simply stepped over her. Brenda looked at me, her expression filled with pure, undisguised contempt. "Did you really think you could ruin us?" Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "You thought your little accounting tricks could bring this family down? We are the elite, Riley. We operate on a level you couldn't possibly understand." She reached out and slipped her arm through Thomas's, her diamond bracelet sparkling under the crystal chandelier. Wiping away a single stray tear from her cheek, she put on a show of reclaiming her perfect composure. "You're nothing but a jealous, bitter little girl playing a game you don't even understand," Brenda said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You wanted to embarrass us tonight, but all you've done is prove exactly why we cut you out of our lives. You'll never be on our level. You're just a disappointment." Brenda tilted her chin up, giving me a smug, triumphant sneer. "You lost, you little brat." Thomas let out another booming laugh, tightening his grip around his wife's waist. "Go home, Riley," he dismissed, waving his free hand like he was shooing away an annoying bug. "Go back to your mediocre life. Check the Wall Street Journal tomorrow morning and watch me climb to a level of power you will never even get to look at." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just stood at the edge of the stage, watching them bathe in their grand delusions. I let them soak in the absolute certainty that their wealth was untouchable. I let them savor the taste of a billion-dollar victory they thought was already locked in the vault. That was when the heavy double oak doors of the VIP ballroom were flung open with a deafening, violent crash. The massive wooden doors slammed against the walls, echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. Every single head in the ballroom snapped toward the entrance. A chillingly calm female voice cut through the space, slicing right through Thomas's arrogant laughter. "There is no merger, Thomas." The booming laughter died instantly in Thomas's throat. He choked on his own breath, his chest seizing up. The heavy doors rebounded off the mahogany walls, sending a shockwave of dead silence through the humid air of the ballroom. Every head turned. Regional bank executives, furious judges, bankrupt socialites, and frozen security guards all stared at the threshold. 6 people stepped into the room in chilling, perfect unison. They wore sharp, flawlessly tailored dark suits and carried heavy leather briefcases, radiating a cold, clinical authority. They moved like a coordinated legal army. And then, the woman leading them stepped forward from the center of the group. It was Caroline, my biological mother. The visual contrast between the 2 women in Thomas's life was absolute. Brenda stood by the cocktail tables, practically dripping with frantic, tacky desperation. She wore an over-the-top, loud silk gown that clung to her sweating frame. Her hair was stiff from too much hairspray, and her heavy emerald necklace sat awkwardly against her collarbone. She looked like a woman screaming to a room that no longer cared about how rich she was. Caroline was the exact opposite of that insecure noise. She radiated a lethal, quiet power. She wore a minimalist charcoal gray cashmere suit that draped perfectly over her shoulders. No flashy jewelry, just a vintage leather strap watch on her left wrist. Her silver hair was pulled back into an elegant bun. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. Her sheer presence drained the remaining oxygen from the VIP ballroom. She walked in with the smooth grace of someone who owned every single inch of the floor beneath her. The color drained from Thomas's face, leaving him a sickly, translucent gray. The untouchable arrogance he had been flaunting seconds ago vanished. He stumbled backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping against the polished floor. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. He backed up until the edge of a cocktail table caught him, freezing him in place, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. Over on the floor, Madison stopped her hysterical sobbing. Wiping away smeared mascara with a trembling hand, she stared up at the commanding figure walking down the center aisle. Madison's eyes were wide, completely unable to process what she was seeing. This woman, whom she had been raised to look down on as a pathetic failure, had just shattered her perfect world. The wealthy guests and angry bankers parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and tables, desperate to clear a wide path for Carolyn. The absolute authority coming from her and her legal team demanded total submission. Caroline took slow, rhythmic steps. Each click of her understated heels sounded like a countdown to a final judgment. Her eyes were locked onto Thomas, completely ignoring the whispers and gasps echoing through the stunned crowd. Brenda, realizing her husband was paralyzed by a fear she couldn't comprehend, tried to step up. She puffed out her chest, trying to summon her fading country club superiority. "Who do you think you are?" Brenda demanded, her voice high and trembling frantically in the quiet room. "You can't just barge into a private event. Security, get this woman out of here right now." The private security guards didn't even blink. They stayed glued to the walls, completely intimidated by the federal agents and corporate lawyers standing at the entrance. Caroline didn't even look at Brenda. She treated the screaming woman like an ugly piece of irrelevant furniture, keeping her sharp gaze locked on her ex-husband. Thomas tried to speak. He tried to summon his usual corporate bravado to defend his crumbling empire. He opened his mouth, but his voice failed him. He made a pathetic clutching motion with his right hand, tugging at his stiff collar as if he were actually suffocating. Caroline reached the raised wooden stage and effortlessly stepped up. She walked straight to my side and stopped. We stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the ruined patriarch of the family. The physical resemblance between us was undeniable to everyone in the room. We had the same sharp jawline, the same posture, and the same unbothered, calculating gaze. "For the last 20 years, you've told everyone in this city that I was a broke failure," Caroline began. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and absolutely devastating. It carried effortlessly, shredding whatever dignity he had left. "You told your investors that I begged for alimony on my knees after the divorce. You told your pathetic new wife that I lived in miserable obscurity. You spun a grand narrative where you were the brilliant business mogul, and I was just the tragic, discarded ex-wife who couldn't handle your success." Thomas swallowed hard, a heavy bead of sweat rolling down his pale cheek. He gripped the edge of the cocktail table, his knuckles turning white. "Caroline," he choked out, his voice barely a raspy squeak. "What are you doing here? The Vanguard merger. That's a sealed contract. We finalized the terms. You can't interfere with this. This is federal corporate business." Caroline smiled. It was the exact same razor-thin, polite smile I had given Kendrick earlier. A smile with no warmth and zero mercy. She turned her head slightly, letting her gaze sweep over the stunned bank executives and ruined socialites, letting the finality of the moment hang heavy in the air. Then, she locked her sharp eyes back onto her terrified ex-husband. "I'm not interfering, Thomas," Caroline said, her words landing with the heavy finality of a guillotine. "Hello, Thomas. Meet the CEO of Vanguard Equities." The air left the room. "Did you honestly think Vanguard approached you because your business portfolio had value?" Caroline asked, taking a step closer to the edge of the stage. "Your portfolio is a toxic wasteland of over-leveraged debt. I directed my acquisition team to make you an offer. I artificially inflated your valuation just to get you to dump every single liquid asset you had left into this merger. I wanted to dismantle you the very second you felt absolutely safe." "Why?" Thomas gasped, his voice hoarse. He looked back and forth between me and Caroline, his eyes filled with absolute panic. "Why go this far? It was just a divorce. It was just a business split. Why do this to me?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caroline's polished corporate shell slipped away, replaced by the fierce, protective fury of a mother who had waited decades for justice. 24 years ago, Caroline said, her voice vibrating with lethal intensity. Thomas flinched as if he had been slapped. 24 years ago, Caroline repeated, stepping down from the stage to meet his eyes. "I got a phone call at 3 a.m. It was from a payphone at Gate 42 of the Atlanta International Airport." Thomas shut his eyes tight, shaking his head slightly as if trying to physically block out the memory. "It was my 9-year-old daughter," Caroline said, gesturing toward me while staring straight at Thomas. "She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. She was terrified. She told me you promised to take her to Paris for her birthday, but when you got to the gate, you handed her your credit card, told her to go buy a magazine, and walked onto the plane with your mistress. You left a 9-year-old girl all by herself at Gate 42 because she was in the way of your affair." A collective gasp went through the room. The wealthy guests and bankers stared at Thomas with pure, undisguised disgust. I drove 2 hours to get to that airport. Caroline's voice slowed to a dangerous, quiet rhythm. I found her sitting on the floor, clutching her little suitcase, waiting for a father who was never coming back. I held her and let her cry until she fell asleep in my arms. Caroline took a final step toward Thomas, invading his space. He shrank back, terrified of the quiet rage coming off her. That night, I made myself a promise, Thomas, Caroline whispered, her words echoing in the dead silent room. I promised I would build a machine so big, so powerful, and so relentless that one day it would swallow you whole. Every company I bought, every competitor I crushed, every billion added to my net worth was for this exact moment. I built Vanguard to ruin you. Thomas's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, falling heavily to his knees right in front of Caroline. The once mighty Atlanta real estate mogul was broken, reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess. "Caroline, please," Thomas begged, reaching out to grab the hem of her cashmere coat. She immediately stepped back, refusing to let him touch her. "Please, the SEC will lock me up. The investors will ruin me. I'll go to prison. We can negotiate. We can make a deal. I'll sign everything over to you. Just complete the merger, please." He was crying now. Tears streamed down his gray-lined face. He desperately pressed his hands together as if praying. "I'll give you whatever you want," Thomas pleaded, his voice cracking into a high whine. "Name your price." Caroline looked down at him with nothing but cold indifference. "I already own everything." She raised her left hand. One of the sharp corporate lawyers immediately stepped forward. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in black cardstock. It was the Vanguard merger agreement, the contract that represented Thomas's salvation, his freedom, and his entire empire. The lawyer handed the heavy documents to Caroline. Thomas looked up at the papers, his eyes flickering with desperate hope. He reached his hands toward them like a drowning man reaching for a lifesaver. Caroline gripped the top of the bound contract. With one swift, forceful motion, she ripped the thick stack of documents completely in half. The sound of tearing paper was sharp and loud, echoing through the ballroom like a final sentence. Thomas let out a choked, breathless cry. Caroline let go, letting the shredded remains of the Vanguard merger fall. The pieces drifted through the air, landing right at Thomas's feet, burying his expensive leather shoes in the paper scraps of his ruined empire. The silence in the room was absolute. The shredded pieces of the Vanguard agreement covered Thomas's shoes like snow on a fresh grave. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The room full of wealthy guests and bankers was completely paralyzed by the scale of the destruction they had just witnessed. I stepped down from the stage and stood right next to my mother. The physical space between us felt like an impenetrable fortress of power. We were a united front of absolute financial ruin for him. I looked down at the man who had haunted my entire life, and I felt the last lingering trace of childhood fear vanish into nothing. "Let's look at your reality tomorrow morning, Thomas," I said, my voice steady. It carried the clean, clinical authority of a total victor. "Do you know what happens when a merger of this scale vanishes overnight? The market doesn't just adjust, it panics. And thanks to the forensic audit report I personally delivered to the SEC this morning, they know exactly why Vanguard pulled out." Caroline smoothed the lapels of her cashmere coat with chilling calm. "Your entire commercial real estate portfolio was put up as collateral for this acquisition, Thomas. You used our signed letter of intent to secure massive short-term bridge loans from the very bankers standing in this room, all just to keep your fraudulent shell companies from collapsing." As the words left my mouth, several of the regional bank executives flinched. They immediately reached into their tailored suit pockets, pulling out their smartphones with urgent speed. I watched them frantically text their risk management departments, frozen credit lines starting right there on the ballroom floor. "The exact second Vanguard officially and publicly backs out of this deal, those bridge loans go into default," I stated ruthlessly, driving the final nail into his coffin. "And Vanguard just backed out. That means you're not just facing a liquidity crisis. You are legally insolvent. You owe your creditors $412 million that do not exist. Your offshore accounts are frozen. Your domestic assets are built on forged ledgers. You have nothing. By 9 tomorrow morning," Caroline took over, her voice cutting like glass, "every domestic account in your name will be seized. The deed to your Buckhead mansion will be locked down. The imported luxury cars your wife drives around town will be towed right out of your driveway. You won't even have the liquid funds to hire a defense attorney, let alone buy a cup of coffee. The reality of his absolute ruin finally broke through Thomas's delusions. The billionaire's arrogant mask shattered completely. Under his own weight, his knees buckled. He collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor, landing right on top of the shredded Vanguard contracts. The physical collapse of his massive ego was stunning. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely discarding the last shred of human dignity he had left. He dragged himself toward Caroline like a beaten dog, his hands shaking violently as he reached for her shoes. "Caroline, please!" Thomas sobbed. The sound was wet and pathetic, a desperate, sickening whine echoing horribly through the quiet room. "I'm begging you. You have billions. Just give me a fraction of it. 50 million, 20 million. Just enough to cover the immediate margin calls so I don't go to federal prison. I'll agree to anything. I'll put the company in your name. I'll sign the house over to you. Just don't let them lock me away." Caroline looked down at the crying man clawing at the air by her feet. She didn't kick him. She didn't yell. She treated him as if he were completely invisible. Turning her head, she looked at me, a genuine warmth finally entering her sharp eyes. "You did an incredible job with that audit, Riley. Your grandfather would be so proud to see the brilliant woman you've become." Realizing Caroline was an impenetrable wall of ice, Thomas frantically twisted his body on the floor and turned toward me. He reached up, grabbing the hem of my dress, his tears staining the clean fabric. "Riley, please!" he begged, his face twisted in sheer terror. "I'm your father. You have to help me. I gave you life. You can't just watch your own flesh and blood rot in a cell. Please, call the SEC. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the audit was wrong." I looked down at his tear-streaked face. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no lingering family loyalty, just the clean satisfaction of a long-awaited justice finally arriving. "You stopped being my father 24 years ago at Gate 42. I said, my voice completely empty. I deliberately took a step back, pulling my dress from his sweaty, desperate grip. "Right now, I'm just a whistleblower." Behind him, Brenda let out a sharp, blood-curdling wail. She looked around wildly, realizing her high society status was officially dead. Her credit cards were now worthless pieces of plastic. She lunged toward Kendrick, who was still slumped near the edge of the stage, demanding he do something to fix this. But Kendrick just pushed her away, completely hollowed out by the doom heading his way. The entire family dynamic had collapsed into a pit of vipers tearing each other apart in the dark. Right then, the heavy mahogany walls of the ballroom began to flicker. A rhythmic flash of light cut through the tall, arched windows, piercing the dim, elegant lighting of the country club. Red and blue, red and blue. Wailing sirens cut through the heavy, humid air, growing louder and more aggressive. The strobe lights of the police cruisers painted the ballroom in alternating shades of crimson and deep blue. The sirens suddenly cut out, replaced by the heavy synchronized thud of tactical boots marching up the grand stone steps of the country club. The tension in the room shattered into pure panic. The remaining mahogany door was pushed open with brute force. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their backs flooded the space. The FBI and IRS had arrived, moving with terrifying professional efficiency. The wealthy guests and angry bankers didn't just move out of the way, they scrambled. They pressed their backs against the expensive silk wallpaper, dropping their cocktail glasses, pulling their spouses aside to clear a wide, completely unobstructed path down the center of the room. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal raid. A tall, broad-shouldered lead agent, a silver badge clipped to his belt, marched straight toward the stage. He didn't look at the crystal chandeliers or the terrified millionaires cowering in the corners. His eyes were locked entirely on Thomas, who was still kneeling in the shredded remains of the Vanguard contracts. Before the agent could even speak, Brenda snapped. The reality of her vanishing country club empire triggered a hysterical, frantic rage. She lunged forward, throwing herself between the federal agents and her husband. Her face was bright red, her expensive silk gown rustling as she puffed out her chest in a pathetic final display of authority. "You can't be in here," Brenda screamed, pointing a diamond-covered finger directly at the agent's chest. "This is a private event. Do you know who we are? I will have your badge. I will sue you, your department, and the entire federal government. We play golf with the state senator." The lead agent didn't even blink. He barely acknowledged her existence, simply giving a sharp nod to a female agent to his left. The female agent stepped forward, grabbing Brenda's upper arm with a firm, unyielding grip, and pulled the screaming woman back. Brenda struggled and wailed, her tacky emerald necklace clattering against her collarbone, but her threats evaporated into useless noise as she was dragged to the edge of the room, her social dominance permanently extinguished. The lead agent stopped 2 feet from Thomas. With absolute clinical detachment, he looked down at the ruined mogul. "Thomas, you are under arrest," the agent's voice boomed, easily cutting through Brenda's fading screams. "We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest on 53 counts of wire fraud, grand conspiracy to embezzle, and massive coordinated tax evasion." The words finally broke through Thomas's shattered mind. The reality of a federal prison sentence materialized right in front of him. The begging, crying man vanished, replaced by pure, animal panic. The total destruction of his ego was complete. He couldn't talk his way out of this, and he couldn't buy his way out either. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the scattered paper contracts. He spun around, completely abandoning his family, his pride, and his dignity, and bolted desperately toward the velvet-draped door leading to the kitchen service hallway. He didn't even make it 5 steps. A tactical agent monitoring the right side of the room moved with incredible speed. Closing the distance, he dropped his shoulder and drove his full weight directly into Thomas's midsection. The impact was brutal and loud. Thomas hit the hardwood floor with a sickening thud, the wind completely knocked out of him. He let out a raspy groan as his face was pressed hard against the polished mahogany floor. The agent quickly pulled Thomas's arms behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut with a sharp sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. The once untouchable patriarch was now just a common criminal, writhing helplessly on the floor of his own exclusive club. The lead agent calmly pulled a laminated card from his pocket and began reading the Miranda rights. His voice was steady and methodical, detailing the loss of every single right Thomas thought his wealth could buy forever. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Caroline and I stood on the stage, watching the entire arrest unfold. The federal machine worked flawlessly, dismantling a corrupt empire with absolute precision. It was the beautiful culmination of years of silent, meticulous planning. As 2 agents roughly hauled Thomas to his feet, his head hung low in total defeat. The lead agent slipped the card back into his jacket. Shifting his attention away from the ruined father, he slowly scanned the raised stage. His eyes bypassed Caroline and me, settling squarely on the corner of the platform. He locked onto the architect of the offshore accounts. Kendrick was still slumped against the wall, staring blankly at the chaos. His shattered smartphone lay uselessly at his feet, his hands trembling in his lap. The lead agent took heavy, deliberate steps toward the stage. "Kendrick," the agent said, his voice cutting through the remaining tension like a scalpel. "Don't bother trying to run. We have a warrant for you, too." Kendrick's face went completely slack. All the color drained from his manicured features, leaving him a sickly, translucent white. For the last decade, he had built a reputation as the smartest legal mind in Atlanta, a man who could build financial fortresses and bury any inconvenient truth under mountains of corporate jargon. But looking at the federal agent standing at the edge of the stage, Kendrick realized his intelligence had just walked him straight into a federal trap. He didn't try to keep his composure. He didn't ask for legal representation or demand to see the warrant. Kendrick collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees, his expensive suit pants tearing on the rough edge of the wooden platform. He threw his hands high in the air in a gesture of total, unconditional surrender. "I'll cooperate!" Kendrick screamed, his voice cracking in hysterical panic. "I'll cooperate fully. Just don't put me in cuffs. I'll give you everything. I have the ledgers. I have the routing numbers for the Cayman accounts. He did all of it." Kendrick pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at Thomas, who was still held tightly by the tactical agents. "He made me do it," Kendrick wailed, completely throwing away attorney-client privilege and any family loyalty to save himself. "Thomas orchestrated the entire Vanguard fraud. I told him it was illegal. I told him we were crossing the line, but he threatened to write Madison out of the will if I didn't forge the valuations. I have proof. I have recordings of him ordering the wire transfers. I'll testify against him. Just give me a deal. Please, give me a deal." The cowardice on display was absolutely breathtaking. The room was already reeling from Thomas's arrest, but now the crowd watched in sheer disgust as this slick corporate lawyer, terrified of losing his own freedom, didn't hesitate for a single second to sacrifice his own father-in-law. Down on the floor, Thomas struggled weakly against the heavy grip of the federal agents pinning him down. "You traitor!" Thomas choked out, spitting blood onto the polished hardwood floor. "You ungrateful, spineless parasite. I gave you your career." Kendrick completely ignored him, keeping his panicked eyes locked onto the lead FBI agent. "I can get you the recordings right now," Kendrick rambled, sweat pouring down his forehead. "I have them backed up on a secure cloud server. Just tell me you'll recommend leniency. Tell me I don't have to go to prison." I took a step forward, leaving Caroline's side, and walked to the very edge of the stage. I looked down at Kendrick, watching him beg and grovel in the dust of his shattered pride. Reaching into my suit pocket, I pulled out an encrypted titanium flash drive. "He won't need to get those recordings for you, Agent Miller," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. I held out the drive. The lead agent stepped forward, giving me a respectful nod as he took it from my hand. "He already submitted them," I stated, looking directly into Kendrick's terror-filled eyes. "Yesterday afternoon, under the supervision of my firm, Kendrick signed a federal proffer agreement. He's been wearing a wire all night." The silence that fell over the VIP ballroom was heavy. Kendrick flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck. He shut his eyes tight and bowed his head, sinking into absolute, undeniable shame. He thought he could play both sides, secretly securing a plea deal while maintaining his place in Thomas's inner circle until the very last second. He had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings of his immunity deal from behind the scenes. The truth sent a fresh wave of shock through the remaining crowd. The bankers and socialites backed away even further. They realized that every conversation, every hushed admission, and every arrogant boast made at this cocktail party tonight had been recorded by the federal government. But the most devastating reaction didn't come from the bankers, and it didn't come from Thomas. It came from Madison. She had been standing rigid by the overturned cocktail table, watching her father get handcuffed. But my words shattered her shock. Her head snapped toward Kendrick, her perfectly made-up face twisting into a mask of pure, raw betrayal. The pieces instantly fell into place in her mind. Her husband, the man she married to secure her place as part of Atlanta's ultimate power couple, had sat in a federal office yesterday. He had signed the documents that ruined her family. Then he had come home, put on a tuxedo, smiled at her, and walked into her family's celebration wearing a wire, with the explicit intention of sending her father to a federal prison. "You wore a wire," Madison whispered, her voice trembling with a terrible, poisonous disbelief. Kendrick looked up at her, his face covered in sweat and tears. "Madison, you have to understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "They had me cornered. Riley had my signature on the forged appraisal reports. I was looking at 20 years. I had to do it. For us. For our future." "Our future?" Madison repeated the words, the taste of ash in her mouth. "You sold my father to the FBI to save your own pathetic skin? You wore a wire to my party?" Madison's carefully constructed high society persona collapsed entirely. Years of finishing school etiquette, country club manners, and polite passive-aggressiveness dissolved in a single second. She let out a raw, blood-curdling scream that tore through the ballroom. Kicking off her designer heels, she lunged. Madison flew across the polished floor, her manicured hands curled into claws, aiming straight for Kendrick's face. She moved with blinding speed, driven by the absolute fundamental betrayal of a husband who had actively destroyed her entire existence. "You bastard!" Madison screamed, crossing the distance in a flash. "I'll destroy you!" Kendrick shrieked, throwing his hands up to shield his face, cowering on the floor as his wife descended upon him. She never touched him. Two tactical agents, anticipating the violence, intercepted her midair. They grabbed her arms and waist, using her own momentum to bring her to the ground. Madison fought like a wild animal, kicking and thrashing wildly against the heavy body armor of the federal agents. She shook her head frantically, screaming insults at Kendrick as they dragged her away from the stage. "Get her out of here," the lead agent ordered, his eyes never leaving Kendrick. As the agents dragged a kicking and screaming Madison through the broken double doors, the lead agent pulled a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Your immunity deal was contingent on full, honest cooperation, Kendrick," the agent stated, his voice completely devoid of mercy. "But you failed to disclose the offshore accounts you opened under your personal name to siphon funds from Thomas's fraud. We found them this morning." Kendrick's eyes widened in sheer terror as the agent stepped onto the stage. "The deal is off," the agent said, grabbing Kendrick by the collar and roughly hauling him off the floor. "You're under arrest." 1 month later, the dust over Atlanta had finally settled, but the massive crater left by the collapse of the Vanguard Empire was still smoldering. The federal legal system worked with cold, clinical efficiency, completely erasing my former family from high society. They had built their entire identity on the fragile illusion of untouchable wealth. When that illusion was shattered under the weight of the federal indictment, they were immediately left with nothing. Thomas was held in a maximum security federal detention center, awaiting trial. The 53 counts of wire fraud and grand embezzlement were open and shut, backed by a mountain of digital evidence and the recordings his own son-in-law had initially provided. The second his assets were frozen under federal anti-racketeering laws, his expensive defense attorneys vanished. He was left with a tired public defender who told him bluntly that a guilty plea was his only option to avoid spending the rest of his life behind bars. Thomas faced a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison. The man who once ordered around state senators and bank executives now wore standard orange scrubs, ate lukewarm cafeteria food, and shared a cramped concrete cell with a convicted car thief. His custom Italian suits were gone. His country club membership was permanently revoked. His name became a toxic punchline in the financial district. The destruction of his ego was absolute. Brenda experienced a poetic, deep punishment that felt almost scripted. The IRS seized her beloved suburban mansion, her luxury SUVs, and every piece of jewelry bought with stolen corporate funds. With no marketable skills and a highly public ruined reputation, she was forced to find work immediately just to pay rent on a cramped, dark studio apartment on the edge of the city. The former queen of the country club, the woman who used to terrorize waitstaff and demand to see the manager, now wore a stiff polyester uniform, working as a housekeeper at a mid-tier airport hotel. She spent her days pushing a heavy cleaning cart down endless fluorescent-lit hallways, scrubbing toilets and changing stained sheets. The woman who once threw tantrums over thread counts now returned home every night with aching feet and hands raw and red from cheap industrial bleach. Madison didn't fare any better. The moment she learned the truth about her husband wearing a wire to their family celebration, her marriage was over. Their divorce was finalized in record time, but there were no assets left to divide. Kendrick's secret offshore accounts were seized by the government, and Madison's massive trust fund was completely liquidated to repay the defrauded Vanguard investors. Stripped of her wealth, her social standing, and her husband, Madison was thrown directly into the harsh reality of the working class. She now worked as a cashier at a local discount supermarket. Her exhausting shifts were spent scanning barcodes, bagging groceries, and enduring the impatient sighs of rude customers. The harsh beep of the cash register replaced the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Her manicured nails were long gone, replaced by a shapeless blue vest over a plain white polo. Whenever a former private school classmate pushed a shopping cart through her lane, she kept her head down, her face burning with a deep, permanent shame. Kendrick fell the hardest. His arrogant attempt to play both sides backfired catastrophically. Because he hid the offshore accounts he used to siphon money, breaching his immunity agreement, federal prosecutors threw out his deal completely. He was disbarred, his license stripped away by the State Bar Association with brutal speed. Unemployable, disgraced, and penniless, Kendrick faced his own separate federal indictment. Renting a single room above a noisy auto repair shop, he spent his days desperately writing letters to former colleagues who threw them straight into the trash. The brilliant legal architect was reduced to a broke outcast, completely exiled from the legal world he once ruled. Their misery was a closed book. I didn't dwell on it. I simply observed their endings with the quiet detachment of an auditor closing the final ledger. I adjusted my seat, sinking into the plush beige leather of Caroline's private Gulfstream jet. The cabin was a sanctuary of polished mahogany and brushed steel, completely shutting out the noise and chaos of the world below. The soft hum of the engines sent a steady, reassuring vibration through the soles of my shoes. Caroline sat opposite me, holding a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon. The afternoon sun poured through the oval window, illuminating the golden bubbles in her glass. She looked relaxed, completely in her element, finally free of the toxic family burden that had been her ex-husband. We were cruising at 40,000 feet, leaving the Atlanta skyline far behind. Our destination was Paris. It wasn't a business trip, and it wasn't a frantic escape. It was simply a celebration of absolute hard-won freedom. I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid wash down my throat. It tasted incredible. I turned my head to look out the thick glass window, watching the vast, spotless blanket of white clouds stretching to the horizon. The sky above was a brilliant, flawless blue, completely free of limits or boundaries. When they left me at gate 42, they thought they were just getting rid of a burden, I said, my voice steady, completely free of bitterness. They didn't realize they were building the architect of their own ruin. Biology doesn't make a family. Family is the people who send a plane to pick you up when you've been left behind. Caroline smiled warmly, raising her glass to me in a silent gesture of unity and triumph. We clinked our glasses together, the sharp ring chiming beautifully through the luxurious quiet of the cabin. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The lesson of this story is that relationships built on greed and superficial status will always collapse under pressure. When federal agents raided the country club, the illusion of family loyalty vanished in an instant. Kendrick's quick betrayal of Thomas to save himself proved that toxic people only value survival. Madison and Brenda lost their identities because their worth was entirely tied to stolen wealth. True strength doesn't come from money or elite social circles. It comes from having the courage to walk away from abuse and build a real life. Share your own stories of cutting out toxic relatives and leave a comment below.